Has it started? Alright. Okay. Hi, my name is Kyle. I'm gonna I'm gonna be lecturing how to debate economics. I'm also going to be lecturing how to debate using economics. Um, which, fun fact, I agreed to do because I accidentally went off of Facebook for an entire day. So I I replied really late. I replied a day late. So I felt bad. So I was like, you know what? Just game. Let's just do it. Um, but anyway, this is my attempt to do it, and I tried to have fun doing it, which is why I have a lot of clip art. Um, so before I begin, just a couple of disclaimers. The first one is that I will not be able to solve all of your problems. This will not be super comprehensive. For example, I'm not going to be delving really deep into the stock market, for example, even though I already have a bunch of memes for the stock market. Um, it just didn't jive with the flow that I wanted to have for this presentation. The second disclaimer is that um, this presentation is for people who haven't studied economics before, because people who have studied economics tend to be actually good at economics debates. So if you have already studied economics, just go away, leave, because I am shy, and this really isn't for you. I mean, it could be for you. I tried to do something creative with this. The last disclaimer is that these are my opinions. I don't claim to be the absolute authority of anything in anything in my life. Not even okay. Anyway, these are my opinions. I really don't claim to be an absolute authority. I'm not definitive. You could have different takes on the subject, and that's completely fine with me. Um, so the first thing I want to take a look at are some, oh yeah, party hat. First thing I want to take a look at are some misconceptions that I want to correct, because I feel like when people look at economics, they have some sort of preconceived notion about what it is, and viewing a subject with a certain lens can certainly be a mistake, because it primes your expectations, um, and it influences how you look at everything that you learn in that subject. So if you come here thinking that economics is already going to be boring, and then you're going to come out thinking, yeah, that is really boring. The first one is that it's about money, when it's not. It's actually about structures of incentives and how people make their decisions. The technical, the textbook definition of economics is about allocating resources, but it doesn't really say what resources are. So when we talk about incentives, these incentives are the factors that shape those allocations of resources, which is also the reason why I'm going to look at examples that are not traditionally associated with economics here. I'm going to take a look at health. I'm going to take a look at religion. I'm going to take a look at politics. Um, Another misconception is that there's a huge political bias in favor of capitalism in economics, and I don't think that that's true. I think it's pretty balanced. Um, so you have a lot of very socialist ways of thinking that are that were created by economists. So Pigouvian taxes that are made in order to correct for negative externalities that are actually done by corporations, invented by economists. There are lots of, yeah, Frederick Engels was an economist. Um, so I think that there are different schools of thought that you can get using the same set of facts. So it's not really politically biased, in my opinion. The notion that it's hard or annoying to debate, I don't really think that's true. What I do think is that it's a different language, and I will talk about why economists have a vested interest in making sure that their language is inaccessible. The spoiler is that we do it because you want to get hired. Like, the more inaccessible econ is, the more likely we are to get hired. Um, but after you move past that language barrier, it's actually surprisingly easy. And the last one is that it's a science, because economists will tell you that it's a science, but It's not. It's not. It's not. Well, to be fair, I'm joking. I think it is. It has some characteristics that are very scientific, um, but that's for philosophers of science to debate about, not me. I mean, at least not for this lecture. So next, I want to take a look at supply and demand, which is like the most basic that there is. Um, these are common observations about human behavior. So for you, and you're the consumer here, you're the buyer. If things are cheap, you buy more of them, and if things are more expensive, you buy less of them. If you're a supplier, you're a producer of that good. If it is cheap, it's going for cheap. You produce and sell less, and the reason why you want to produce and sell less is because you won't get as much revenue off of it. And at the same time, if you sell it for a high price, you tend to produce more of it because that's where you maximize the revenue that you generate, right? So it's very common. This is for regular or normal goods, what we call them. There are some exceptions like luxury items, like diamonds and whatnot, where the more expensive something is, the higher the demand for it. But that's an outlier. The general rule is that if something is cheap, you buy more of it, and you sell less of it. We have this thing called equilibria. This is where supply and demand meet. Basically, what this means is that everything that the market produces is bought by a consumer. So walang excess. There's no excess. There's no shortage. It's just right. It's chef's kiss. It's Goldilocks, right? But when you move away from that equilibrium, you either go to a surplus where the supply exceeds the demand, or a shortage where the supply um, is less than demand. So everything above the equilibrium point, that's a surplus. Everything below it is a shortage, and you want an equilibrium because you want things to be running very smoothly. So if you have a surplus, you want to lower the price so that the demand goes up, right? Or the supply goes down and stuff like that. But then you might be asking me, well, Kyle, how will you use this in a debate? And my answer is, eh, eh. But really, I think you can just apply it to a lot of different phenomena if you free your mind, so to speak. You can use it for minimum wage, for instance. You can use the same kind of thinking with that. If you treat work or labor as the good, and the employer as the consumer, and you, the laborer or the supplier, you have the same thing. You have the same analysis here, because wage, that is to say, the compensation that is given to you by your employer for the work that you do as a laborer, that you can consider that to be the price of your labor. So you are the supplier of that labor. So if minimum wage goes up, right? That means that as a laborer, you want to supply more. You want to really look for a job because you're going to have a really high minimum wage. But at the same time, because the price of getting labor is so high, the consumers, in this case the employers, tend to demand laborers a little bit less, which is why a lot of classical economists say that um, they oppose the minimum wage. It's a market distortion, they say, because what ends up happening is that you create a shortage of jobs. People hire less than what we need. The logic is also the same for maternity leaves. This is not just maternity. I'm not against motherhood, but about maternity leaves. Um, Essentially, maternity leaves are like you're allowed to not show up to work for 180 days if you are pregnant or you just gave birth, and you use that time to recover, to care for your child. And even though you don't show up for work, your employer will still have to pay for your wage during that time. So that is a good thing. But if you're the employer, you'll tend to demand female laborers less. And that's a problem, right? Especially if you consider the nuance to um, females, to women, um, because they're not likely to get a job na nga because employers don't want to hire them because they're too expensive. And also, at the same time, they have to bear the costs of bearing a child. And having children is very costly, right? You can also apply this to religion. Like, because in religions, what they do is the supplier is a religion and they want to sell you God, or they want to sell you their version of God, or basta ganon, and you are the consumer. They're vying for your devotion. So what's the price? Right? The price of entering a religion is everything that comes with the religion. So if you enter the religion and you're expected to go to church and donate like 50% of your earnings, that's a lot. That's a high price to pay to enter a religion. Which means that if it is very difficult to become a devout follower of that religion, you're less likely to enter or to cooperate with that religion. But at the same time, if it is so costly for an individual to enter a religion, that's also the point in time where the religion wants to advertise that religion the most it can. Because if they get to convert you, um, those requirements make you a very productive member of that religion. So the price, if it goes up, um, disincentivizes consumers from joining the religion. It also incentivizes the religion to produce more of it, or like advertise it some more. Like there are more openings in our religion or something like that. But what is a quantity? Because earlier we said for labor, the quantity that is being demanded or being produced is the are the jobs. Or for example, in the apple market, the quantity is the what you're demanding, what you're supplying, they're apples. But here, the Q depends on who's doing the study. So it could be the probability of a person converting, in which case, if you're studying it, you make a graph and then the x axis is a range between 0 and 1. Or you can also take a look at the number of hours that a person goes to church or does religious stuff. Or you can make a separate index saying this is how you measure religiosity, and people have done that. So it really depends on how you frame the benefit that religions want to get. So if you're debating that, it's part of the framing exercise. It also works if you wanna put a tax on soda and other kinds of things, like put a tax on soda, put a tax on cigarettes, put a tax on vaping or whatever. What you want to do as the government is to show how, by increasing the costs that are associated with consuming that particular good, demand for it goes down, right? So that's basically how you explain on government why it's okay to have these kinds of taxes. That's the most basic way to look at it. You can also use it for privatizing prisons, where you want to take a look at the costs that the state incurs when they want to incarcerate people. What happens to the justice system if you put a profit incentive in it, and things like that. It also applies to debate tournaments, because if you notice, a lot of debate tournaments are more like the debate tournaments are more likely to be hosted if the organizers get something in return. So the price in this case are the registration fees. So siguro maybe in the future we can have a study where we just take a look at a lot of registration fees and create a demand curve for it. And we also take a look at the attendees. Like there are less attendees of a tournament if it's just exorbitantly expensive to enter that tournament, for example. Yeah. So why does this work? Why is it that I just use supply and demand, but I applied it to a lot of different things? It works because these are all transactions. And the main takeaway that I want people to have is that as long as you understand the rules of the transaction itself, and the incentives of the people who are parties to to those transactions, you can understand economics, all kinds of economics, no matter where they are, where you find them, ganon, no matter how it shows up or how it presents itself to you, because that's really all it is. And at this point, I really hope that you have this sort of galactic brain galactic brain epiphany or something, because when I was studying, this is how I viewed it. I started dreaming about how to optimize my sleeping so that I get everything I wanted done, those kinds of things. Anyway, so since we just talked about transactions, it's useful to think of them as building blocks. And what does this mean? This means that everything that you do is a transaction. Like you buy something, yeah, you buy something, and then you give money to a producer, and in turn, the producer gives you a particular good. So what's important here is that whatever you spend in exchange for a good is also income for the producer of that good. That necessarily means that the more you spend, that also means that there are more goods that you spent your money on. Because like income is just compensation for goods produced or services that are rendered. So what happens is the more that you spend, the more those people get income, and the more those people get income, the more they'll produce, and the more they'll buy other things as well. So it's in this sense that economists say that spending drives the economy, um, which is why if you look at the formula for GDP, it's consumption plus investment plus government spending, and all three of those relate to spending. Consumption is like your private use of your money. Government spending is just how the government uses money, and investment is how people use money and in lending it to other people. And when you lend that money to other people in the form of an investment, you empower the borrowers to spend even more. So literally, the entire GDP is about spending. So the entire economy is made up of these interactions because, um, like we said, if you spend your money on something, the producers of that get income, and those producers end up being able to interact with other people, and those people interact with other people. It's just the same interaction that's repeated over and over again. And when you zoom out, it's basically the market. And there's a market for all different types of goods. There's a market for wheat. There's a market for burgers. There's a market for steak or whatever, for food, for cement, ganyan. But they all follow mostly the same rules for each transaction. It is just like you just zoom out. So it's like a snowflake where if you look at a snowflake, or in this case, you look at the economy, you go like, wow, that looks very complicated. But if you zoom in, it's just a repetition of the same shapes. It's just a repetition of triangles. This is the, if I'm saying it, the Koch snowflake or something. So that's basically what happens here. Um, each triangle is a single interaction, and it just repeats and repeats, and then you get this wonderful, crazy, complicated looking thing. So there are two important things that you can take from this. The first one is that we obviously find patterns when things are repeated over time, and from those patterns we get um, some conclusions about behavior, and they can tell us something about the way people behave and why they behave that way. Um, Now we want to talk about government, because government is the biggest party to these transactions. They're the biggest buyers. They're the biggest sellers, and the ways that they can interact with the economy are through fiscal policies and monetary policies. A fiscal policy is basically when the government sets tax rates or when the government spends something. And monetary policy can be done in either two ways: the manipulation of the interest rates, setting interest rates, and the printing of money. We'll talk about monetary policy later, but the summary is that first of all, it's controlled by the central bank. Oops. First of all, it's controlled by the central bank, and secondly, it has a lot to do with credit, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. But first, let's talk about fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is all about taxes and spending, because taxes they cut a percentage of your disposable income. Um, it says here that they're the lifeblood of government because the government needs tax for revenue in order to fund its projects. But essentially, what happens here is that, for example, your tax rate is 10% and you earn 1,000 pesos. Um, your disposable income, the income that you can actually use, is less than 1,000. If the tax rate is 10%, 10% of 1,000 is 100, which means that it's 1,000 minus 100. Your actual disposable income is just 900. Um, so uh, you look at your tax table. We won't use this later. It's just for your reference. Like you can take your family's earnings and then look for your bracket on the left, and then input your family's earnings in the formulas on the right, and that's your tax liability for any particular year. Anyway, so there's expansionary and contractionary fiscal policy. Expansionary policy is to lower taxes, and if you lower taxes, you increase disposable income, which means that each individual person has more money to spend. And expansionary policy also involves government spending. So the reason why they do this, as we said, is to drive the economy, and you want to do that in order to combat recession. But there's also contractionary policy, where you decrease spending by increasing taxes or decreasing government spending. But why would you do that? You do that because if you just keep driving the economy, it's not always good. It creates inflation. So sometimes when inflation is really, really, really bad, you have austerity measures which will force governments to spend less or increase taxes in order to control inflation. So at this point, you might be all like, I don't understand. I don't understand why inflation. I thought spending was good. Why does it cause inflation? But first of all, don't worry. It's normal if you're confused. Um, Actually, economists have a vested interest in making you confused. But also, hopefully, we can tackle some of the reasons why those things happen in the next few slides. Um, so, we're going to talk about credit now, which is misunderstood by a lot of people. And that's why you have stonks memes. Because if you take a look at financial instruments and stuff like that, the truth is that we don't really know a lot about these things, which is why a lot of people say it's some sort of secret society where it's just a bunch of men in suits that are shouting money terms like cross pollination or something like that. So first, what is credit? Um, Credit, kasi if you take a look at the Truth in Lending Act, well, first of all, credit is not defined specifically in any law. But in the Truth in Lending Act, it gives you a list of different transactions where credit is involved. It's a really long list, but it doesn't really define what credit is. The closest that I remember that we have to a definition is from the court, where the court said that credit is any sum that is credited to another person or something, which for me is tautological because you're saying that essentially its credit is something that is credited, which for me it doesn't really make sense. Um, so for me, what I did was to take a look at credit markets or bonds markets, which is, James bonds, um, which are markets for borrowing and lending money. So you have bonds that they're basically pieces of paper that say I owe you, like if I buy a bond, that means you are lending me money and I owe you something. So bonds is a fancy word for debt, which is another word for credit. So if you understand what a debt is, you understand what bonds are. But the question is, do you really understand what a debt is? This is where I want to take a look at interest rates. Interest rates are the reason why people are willing to loan you money at all in the first place. Because if you are a stranger and then you come up to me asking for a loan, I'm not really sure if you're gonna pay me back. So if I do loan you some money, I'm going to be taking a big risk that I won't be paid back. That's the reason why I impose an interest rate. Because an interest rate is basically an added amount that our borrower will pay. So an interest rate it works like this. If I borrow 1,000 pesos again, and then the interest rate is 10%, I not only have to pay the lender back for the original 1,000%, or that the original amount is called the principal. I also have to pay that person the interest, which is the 100 pesos that I add. Gets ba? So it's an added amount. I'll have to pay the amount that I initially borrowed plus the interest on that loan. So the reason why people do that is because it is basically the compensation for the lender for the risk that he or she incurs by lending. So if a person is very risky, like there's a higher risk that person won't pay you back, that's the point in time that banks, for example, or lenders are going to impose higher interest rates. Um, so the higher and so now you can look at it from a supply and demand point of view. Like for the borrower, the rate is the price of borrowing, and for the lender, the rate is what they stand to gain from lending. So the lender now becomes the supplier of these bonds or these loans. The borrowers are the consumers. So you create demand and supply schedules for bonds, and you can basically ang sinasabi ko lang ay if the rate is higher, the suppliers want to produce more. So if the interest rate is higher, lenders are more willing to lend money. And at the same time, if the rates are higher, borrowers will be less willing to borrow. And vice versa. If you have a low interest rate, you're probably going to have a lot of borrowers but not a lot of lenders. And again, this is just because supply and demand. This leads me to something about poverty, and I think it's very um, relevant because we've seen a lot of people saying lately that poverty is a choice, that it is a state of mind, for example, um, that there are actually lots of opportunities and it's just up to the person to use it wisely, and it's an excuse to be lazy. But I think that you can predict what my stance is because my stance is, along with a lot of the debate community have this stance, we say that it's not the poor that failed themselves, it's the system that failed the poor. Because the reality is that they don't really have those opportunities that one of the commenters said that they had and aren't just utilizing. Um, but how did the system fail the poor? And I want to take a look at credit as a way to examine how the system has failed the poor. Because if you're poor, you need to either get a job or create a business. But how do you get a job? In order to get a job, a nice paying job, okay, that will bring you out of poverty, you need to at least have some skills training. And in order to have skills training, you need to either have the time or the money to go through the skills training. But remember, you're poor, which means that you don't have time. You need to use up all your time to get food for the next day. Or you don't have money, so which means that you can't pay the tuition in order to build your skills, right? In order to make skills, you need a lot of things that you don't have. And if you don't have that, you can't get a job. So ironically, you need a job in order to get a job, right? So if you're poor, where do you get the money? Um, you can probably ask for credit. You can ask the bank for a loan. The problem is banks do not lend to people who are very risky, like what I said. And since you're poor and you don't have a lot of assets, what usually happens is that banks see you as too much of a risk to lend money to. So what happens is that it's either there's no loan that will be given, or there will be a loan that will be given, but with really really high um, interest rates. And what happens is that if you fail to pay back the loan, fail to pay back the interest, um, the lenders can sue you. The lenders can sue you, and if they win the suit, they can get some of your assets, right? And that's a problem here because it's very expensive to be poor. It is very difficult for you to get any money to start anything if you're poor, um, and it will just make the poor poorer in the end. And if you wanna make your own job, if you wanna make a business, you're also gonna need those loans to fund the creation of your business. If you're going to invest in someone else, you need money to be an investor, right? So the system is made so that you first need to have money in order to make money. But if you never had money to begin with, it's very difficult to even find any of those opportunities that people were talking about. So let's move on. Let's talk about cycles. And I promise the poverty thing will come back again. You are a person and you had income, and you got that income from being productive. And you borrowed from the bank, and the bank lends you money. the bank in turn, using the money that you borrowed, you spend. All right, and then the money that you spent makes you happier. It also makes you more productive, and because it made you more productive, it made you more income, and it creates a cycle. But since we have already established that your spending is the income of another person, this cycle creates another cycle, the cycle of the person that you spent money on. And that person's activities creates another cycle. It's a cycle of cycles being created. And this creates some sort of productivity growth because that initial cycle creates more productivity for an individual. And if more people are able to um, undergo through those cycles, then they will also become more productive. And that also means that um, and that also kasi means that they need to add some value into the things that they're selling in order to make a profit. So each and every transaction, may patong yan eh. It's not like the costs of me creating a highlighter is exactly the price that I'm going to be putting on it when I sell it to you. Obviously, I'm going to put something else onto it so that my own productivity will increase. So you find a productivity curve that is smooth like this blue line here. This is you, this is where you start, and then all of your interactions increase productivities of others, etc., etc. And that's great, right? Because productivity over time always increases. Um, but if you notice, if you're poor, you never had any way to participate in this cycle of cycles. So the gap between the rich and the poor just keeps getting wider and wider, specifically because they were systematically excluded from that cycle that makes everyone more prosperous. Um, as a last note, even though this blue line looks at our productivity, it's not it's not really reflective of spending. Spending looks more like this, and the reason why it looks more like this is because we allowed for borrowing to happen. Basically, what happens when you borrow something is that it allows you to have more money, and then you can spend that money, which means that you'll be spending more than you earn. Which is why, in the short run, you're going to be able to spend more money than you earn, and in the long run, and after that, you're going to have to spend less money than what you earn in order to pay back those loans. So the average amount of spending is the same because it cancels each other out. But if you're caught in one of those slumps or in one of those highs, it really changes behavior. And this is really important if you want to understand inflation. It comes back later, I promise. So, what causes inflation? Uh, we have two factors for inflation, at least these very basic ones. You have cost push and demand pull. Cost push, in my opinion, is really important because it says that if you increase the production costs and the cost of producing something, you also increase the price. So, for example, if I, again, with this highlighter, if I'm going to produce this, I need the plastic, I need the ink, I need the felt, whatever that this is, and if it adds up to like 10 pesos per highlighter, I'm going to sell it for more than 10 pesos, a little bit more than 10 pesos. But if the price of any of those materials goes up, I'm also going to have to increase the price of those materials. And that's the reason why an increase in oil prices is very important because oil is used in everything, especially when you want to take a look at transporting goods from one place to another. Um, that's the reason why an increase in oil price usually leads to an increase in price of most other goods. But weirdly enough, and you wouldn't think this, weirdly enough, employment also creates inflation. And the reason for that is because if unemployment is low and like you employ most of your workers, you want to ask yourself, how do we expand as a business? How do we attract more workers in order to expand our productivity? Employers will do that by increasing wages. And so, like, if there are lots of people if most people are employed, employers will be forced to increase wages in order to attract more laborers to them. And when that happens, we need to take a look at labor as, right, it's a means of production because They're one of the factors of production. So, if wages go up, that means that the cost in producing those things will also increase, which is why then that's the reason why inflation can mean that the economy is healthy. It can also mean that lots of people are being employed. But on the other hand, demand pull basically says that if you have a strong consumer demand for a product or service, the price also increases. And the logic for this is because if you know that a lot of your buyers really want to buy your product, um, as a supplier, be like, oh, you want this pala, I'm gonna increase the price because I know you're gonna pay me for it. So if you look at the graph again, the first line that we looked at earlier, um, if you have more demand for it, we shift it to the right, which basically means that you have more demand. And if you notice, the price also increases. Um, so how does spending fit in? If you take a look at this example, what is the price of a single apple if I bought three apples with 120 pesos? And you don't need to be a math genius to say that, oh, you just divide 120 by 4 and you get 120 by 3 and then you get 40 pesos an apple. But if you're thinking about economics, you want to turn that into a formula so that you more clearly see the relationship is between all these different variables. So we see therefore that price is basically just the money spent and the things that you bought. But in order to understand inflation, suppose that you have the same problem. I bought three apples, but I spent 1,200 on all of it. Obviously, you're gonna say, oh, that means it's 400 pesos an apple, and that's inflation. And the reason why there's inflation is because we have more money, but we don't have more apples, right? If you have more money but not a corresponding increase in productivity in the goods that you're creating or you're selling, that's when inflation happens. So you can't just print money to pay off debt, um, because if you print money without a corresponding increase in productivity, the purchasing power of each individual peso or dollar or whatever currency goes down. Um, I bring this up because when I was younger, I was trying to understand this, and they kept just saying the quantity theory of money, which is the more you print, the lower the value is of each individual bill. And I found that this way of looking at it is just easier to understand. Okay, so how does borrowing affect any of this? More borrowing basically means that you have more money, right? If you borrow money, that means you have more money to spend, blah, blah, blah. But that also means that there's more money in circulation, um, which means that if that money isn't productive, it's basically the same as just printing money. So if that money isn't productive, then it also causes inflation. Um, so, yeah, I told you to come back. So, in the short time that we've been together, I think we now have a pretty good way to explain a lot of things. We can explain we need to attract investors or investment because investors want to lend you money because they want to profit, and you want to take a look at either higher interest rates or um, a higher probability that you're going to pay them back. So that's what it means when you have investor confidence. Investor confidence means that they're confident that you're going to pay back, which means that they're much more likely to impose lower interest rates. We also explained a little bit about inequality, where we talked about it's very hard to get loans if you're poor because you're risky. You have bad credit rating, you haven't borrowed anything yet, so you haven't been rated yet. Um, it's a cycle. And loans with high interest are more likely to happen, or um, they're most likely going to be secured by a lot of things. This can be solved, I think, and I haven't discussed that pala kanina. Um, you should look up microfinancing, microcredit, because it tries to solve this problem by encouraging financial institutions to give really small loans that are easy to pay back for the poor, specifically for the poor. We are also able to explain inflation and why it's not always bad. It's most of the time it's a sign that the economy is healthy. Um, and actually, you can even add some more analysis into it by saying it encourages more spending, because if you know that there's inflation, for example, I want to buy a car and right now it's at 1 million pesos. If I know that its price will increase later on, I will probably buy that car now, and that stimulates spending, right? If I know that it's going to be cheaper later on, I'm not gonna spend right now. I'm just gonna spend in the future, which is the reason why I've never spent any money on gaming consoles, because I just keep waiting for the time that they're going to be on sale. We also are able now to explain why um, we shouldn't print money, because inflation. That economics is easy. It's just common sense. It's just studying one interaction and then repeating the same process over and over again until we find a pattern. But here's an interesting problem, and something I hear a lot. People say in some debates, the market has correcting mechanisms for the unethical behavior of companies. Look at H&M, and H&M in particular is the example that's always used. When it was revealed that they used sweatshops and child labor, their stocks plummeted. Um, but what does that really mean? Right? So stockholders are essentially those who sort of own the company. Like if you have a stock, that means you partly own that company. So those stockholders, if you say that a stock plummets, it means that more people want to sell a particular stock or a stake in a company than people want to buy from it. That's what it means when the value of that stock decreases. Um, but why? Why do the stocks plummet when sweatshops and child labor were revealed? Most debates that I have found, they analyze it by saying that stockholders are just now taking principled stances against child labor and sweatshops. And while that might be true, actually, that might be true, um, you might now also be able to analyze it by saying that, look, investors, stockholders, they're expecting profits because they're just lending companies their money. So if H&M stock goes down, that means that stockholders believe that the information about sweatshops, the information about child labor, is going to mean that they're not going to profit as much. So this says less about the stockholders and more about the consumers, because the consumers, we now assume they're most likely going to like boycott or whatever, and that's the reason why the stocks plummet. So this is a reason why boycotts might actually be able to work. Um, so um, it's another added layer of analysis that most people tend to miss out on because they don't understand um, finance as much as is ideal. So you might be saying, "Wow, it's that easy. I'm ready to debate anything now." And fortunately, there's still more. I'm just halfway done. Next, we're gonna be talking about marginal utility and substitution. Let me drink some water. Okay, marginal utility and substitution. This is what I do when I go to a buffet. I think about my marginal utility. I think about substitution. So to explain it, let's take a look at this. If you wanted an apple and you really got one, or if you are really really thirsty and if you're a thirsty boy and you're in a desert and you're really really thirsty, I just want to exaggerate. I just want to emphasize that you're really thirsty, and then you got one. Maybe you're really happy with it, right? But what if you just really wanted one apple and instead of one you get 10? If you're given 10 apples, you'd be like, okay, thanks for the apples. My question here is, would you be as happy with the 10th apple as you were for the first? Obviously not. And this is basically what diminishing marginal utility is. Utility means happiness or contentment or whatever. Um, Basically, the first time I ever drank water, the very first time I ever had an apple, I was really happy with my apple. But after a while, if you keep forcing me to eat apples, I'm gonna be like, yeah, I'm not really that happy with this extra apple anymore. And at some point, you might be having negative utility, which means you're gonna be unhappy with more apples. So, kunyari, if you're forced to eat like 100 apples, like just in one sitting, you're gonna be like, please stop giving me apples. This is literally torture, right? Um, so let's say that you're at a buffet. You're at the Japanese food section, and then you got 16 pieces of California Maki because you're very intense, right? You now have a choice. should you get another California maki or should you get sashimi? And like if you're anything like me, it's like I don't care. I'm just gonna eat all of them. But for most other people, they're gonna be like, oh, this is too much California maki. Let me just get another sashimi. So at this point, kasi you get more utility from substituting maki for sashimi. Sashimi. So anyway, what is the optimal combination of sashimi and maki? This is what I think about when I'm eating at a buffet, like an omakase, not omakase, like sambokojin or something. Um, how do we know what combination of these two goods will make you the happiest? Suppose that you spend all your lunchtime and all your lunch money on just buying and getting California maki. You're eventually going to just get 20 pieces. And if you use all of your resources on sashimi, you get 15. The blue line that connects them, that's your budget. So any combination that is below that budget line is feasible for you to buy, and anything above that is not feasible for you to buy. Um, so how do we find the best combination? And this is where we need to draw indifference curves. Indifference curves look like this. And basically, what this means is that every bundle that is on that curve make you the same amount of happy, right? So let's take a look at these three dots. The first dot, you see that we're going to consume much more sashimi than maki. Let's say that that means you're eating 13 pieces of sashimi and 5 pieces of sushi, for example. Um, and the one that is nearer to the California maki, let's say that that's you eating one sashimi only and 17 pieces of maki, right? The assumption of an indifference curve is that both bundles make you equally happy. And the third one, the one in the middle, is something like, what does it look like? 2 pieces of sashimi and like 6 pieces of maki. So all three of these bundles, they give you the same amount of happiness, right? So like if you're forced to pick between one of those three, you literally won't be able to choose unless you pick at random. Um, so okay, at this point, the reason why this is important is because it gives you the rate of substitution. The slope of every point in that curve tells you how much of one good you're willing to sacrifice for an extra of the other. But imagine if you're in the middle point, um, 2 sashimi and 6 maki. What if you say, like, if you notice that you didn't use up all your budget yet because you're below the budget line? So hypothetically, you could get more of each, right? But that's not on the same indifference curve anymore. So we also now figured out that you have more. We now figured out that you have more indifference curves pala. It keeps getting higher, and this means that for every higher indifference curve, that means that you prefer bundles on those indifference curves more than bundles from lower indifference curves. So the optimal point um, is the highest, the point at which the highest indifference curve has a tangent with the budget line, which is this. A tangent is basically a point where a curve and a line they meet and then they never meet again. This is what a tangent is. In this case, it's this. And this bundle, whatever number you put on those bundles, that's the optimal bundle that will maximize your utility given your particular budget. So at this point, you might be going like, oh my god, Kyle, stop, learn. Let's tell me how to use the sin and the bit. I don't need to learn these graphs. And, okay, fine. I actually use it in a lot of different ways. Not just with buffets, but also for health. So I want to take a look at iatrogenesis. What iatrogenesis is, it's physician-caused illness. And we know that every good has diminishing levels of utility, and healthcare is not an exception to this. So if you keep taking biogesic and you don't have pain, for example, or if you overdose on biogesic, it could be really, really bad for you, right? It could be bad for your organs. Or if you have surgery, for example, heart surgery, that's really, really good. But if you don't need a heart surgery, you get none of the benefits but all of the risks, right? So if doctors, especially in the United States, what they tend to do is they overprescribe medication. They overprescribe opioids, for example, and that leads to a lot of bad outcomes along the road. But why do they do that? They do that because they're making choices to substitute moral behavior for profit-seeking behavior. And if you've watched John Oliver the John Oliver episode where he was talking about marketing to doctors, he was talking about how, in a lot of cases, big pharmaceutical companies negotiate exclusive agreements with doctors that they will only sell a particular kind of medicine. They'll over prescribe that kind of medicine even though they're not that effective. So, for this reason, at those moments, doctors make those substitutions. They um, they subconsciously make those indifference curves and say this is an optimal bundle for me. Um, so this basically just means that in a lot of cases, people are more likely to substitute out moral behavior for behavior that makes them rich. Next, let me talk about rational epidemics. This is also about health, but it's also very relevant to us right now because we're in quarantine, right? Uh, why is it that people still go out? Why do they sacrifice a lot of healthy behavior, right? Even considering that we have an epidemic or a pandemic. Because ideally, people are going to demand at least some level of personal protection. But since there's an opportunity cost, like if you are 100% protected, you're 100% isolated, you're probably not going to be able to get food. That's the opportunity cost. The more time that you spend inside, staying at home, the less time that you could spend looking for food. Um, but like, if they don't get food, they're willing to sacrifice some level of protection in order to get that food. And that's the reason why they substitute it. So it's not irrational to take that risk, to take the risk of getting infected. And that's the reason why the government is trying to be very harsh on people who violate quarantine, very harsh on people who violate those guidelines, because they want to increase the cost of going out so that people are less likely to substitute healthy behavior, meaning staying at home, with going out. The problem is that for a lot of cases, not making that substitution will mean that they'll die from starvation, and starvation is a really ugly way to die. So even if you get arrested, you might get arrested, or you might get infected. If you're going to die from hunger, you're going to take the risk and make that substitution. And at that point, if you're the government, maybe you can say, oh, if they're gonna die, how about let's impose the punishment that if you leave your house, let's shoot them. Let's shoot them dead, right? Um, if that happens, will it prevent people from leaving their homes to get food? I don't think so. Because the cost will now be the same. The cost of you leaving and the cost of you staying will both be death. So, for those individuals who are poor, they don't have access to food or a grocery or whatever, they're going to have to, they're now indifferent between choosing one bundle, which is staying out, and another bundle, which is staying in. So, what that happens is people just flip a coin, it lands on the side that says go out to get food, and they're gonna get out. If they die, it's the same. Like they're gonna die either way. So my fear now is government can now say, oh fine, death isn't enough of a disincentive pala. Let's create a punishment that's worse than death. Let's create torture. It's only when you have a punishment that is literally worse than death that this kind of policy will be effective. Um, so that's the reason why I won't be surprised if there are more cases of inhumane treatment that will be given to them some more. And like in Pampanga, if I'm not mistaken, there are now cases where if you violate quarantine, you're going to be sexually harassed by a bunch of different people, and then they're going to live stream you while you're being sexually harassed. And for me, that's just inhumane, right? Um, because it's very humiliating. So my point here is that, and my point here isn't for people to break the law. I just wanna like make that clear. It's that I do not think that this is the right way to go about um, making people go in. What the government can do, in my opinion, is to lessen the costs of staying inside by providing people with food and basic necessities. Last thing I want to take a look at is human rights. Um, I think we're being kind of intense here. If government says we're gonna kill everyone who goes out, um, violating human rights is the shortcut of governance. And if you don't know how to make people obey you, for example, well, let's just violate their rights. And there's a good reason where a lot of leaders choose to make these violations because even though they're constitutionally and legally invalid, right, they still perceive it to be more effective than the legal ways of doing things. Which is why these leaders are willing to substitute valid, constitutionally sound policies for unconstitutional ones, which they might think are more effective. This is, of course, assuming that those violations are even effective. But okay, fine. Let's argue. Let's assume that for the sake of argument, if they are effective, right? There's now an incentive for leaders to substitute valid actions for effective ones. So the reason why supporters of this president say that we have too much rights kasi yan, is the perception that our rights get in the way of good governance. So if you want to find a balance, we can break this in two ways. First is by breaking the assumption that respect for human rights is contrary to good governance. And the second one is by making it more costly for people in power to violate those rights by holding violators accountable. So you can apply this also to more traditional econ things like automation, because employers make a choice between getting automated and non-automated labor, and this is especially useful for debates about robot taxation. So you can use this way of looking at things. You can also use supply and demand. You also can use this for child labor, like substituting skilled but expensive adult labor for cheap and unskilled adult labor. You can also use this for literally all priority debates, where the motion doesn't tell you to pick one over the other and just prioritize one over the other. But here's a cool example. How about utilitarianism? How does utilitarianism justify the redistribution of wealth? Because there's a misconception that utilitarianism is a tool of the rich. That it's a justification for saying, well, it's okay for the rich people to forget about the poor because the net good that we're creating for society is like we create a net positive in terms of utility because we're creating jobs, blah blah blah. Like it's true that some people do say that, but it's not the only way to view utilitarianism. So if you want to take a look at diminishing marginal utility, this also applies for wealth. So if you were a millionaire, if you had 100 million pesos, and you were given an extra 1,000 pesos, that is only around, no, that is exactly only 0.001% of your total wealth, right? So you just add that like sliver of wealth for in your point of view. So it doesn't really make you that much happier. But if you only had 100 pesos, let's say that you're not that well to do, and then you get um, the same 1,000 pesos, that constitutes 1,000% of your own your current wealth, right? Which means that if the government has the same amount of money and it's trying to choose between who to give it to, should it give it to the rich or the poor, if you're really utilitarian, it's more likely that we're going to give it to the poor because the poor end up having more utility for the same good. So taking it a step further, we can generalize it by saying, okay, if we take, not just give, okay, if we take money, this amount of money from the rich and give it to the poor, would that be okay? Yes, because there's still a net good in terms of utility, right? Because in either case, if you take money from the rich or you take money from the poor, in either case, you're going to be taking money from someone. In either scenario, someone will be harmed. But if you take it from the rich who already have enough wealth, the happiness we're depriving them of is much smaller compared to the happiness that we're going to be generating if you give that same money to the poor. So at this point, where do we stop? Some radical people would say Never. As long as we're not all equal, let's just keep taking. But if you're really utilitarian, I would say that's a valid way to look at it. But if you're really utilitarian, it has to stop somewhere. And that somewhere, if you're an economist and a utilitarian, you would say that you should only stop taking away money from the rich and giving it to the poor when the disutility, the unhappiness that you generate from taking money from the rich is equal to the amount of happiness that you generate by giving that money to the poor. Why? Because if you redistribute any more, you create a net negative. It decreases the total amount of utility in the society. The problem here is that it's actually really hard to find where that point is, where the point where those two things are equal actually is, because the rich, they have more money and they have the ability to be very noisy and they can use their wealth to make their unhappiness heard. But that is not enough of a justification to justify stopping redistribution in general, because their unhappiness is only one side of the equation. You also need to take a look at the happiness that you generate from the poor. And that's the basic way that you can use utilitarianism to be a social justice warrior. Um, so just because someone is from an economics background doesn't necessarily mean that they're slaves to like capitalist system or whatnot. Okay, so it's been an hour. We have another part, which is what if there's no substitute? If there's no substitute, this is where we want to take a look at the importance of competition. Um, if you can, and since it's about competition, I just want to make a disclaimer that I'm not associated with the PCC. I'm not a lawyer either. You can bother Miguel Ventura po, Miguel Ventura. You can bother Venti about it if you want, because I think we're gonna be running out of time if I get super detailed into this. Um, so let's say that you have a lemonade stand. They sell glasses of lemonade for 50 cents a glass. Sorry, masakit lalamunan ko. You sell it for 50 cents a glass. That's around 25 pesos a glass if we're gonna convert it to Philippine currency. If there is no substitution, you are forced to just keep spending 25 pesos for a glass of lemonade. But if you can substitute, um, if you have competition, it's possible that you can have other choices, like this other lemonade stand, um, which costs 25 cents a glass, which is 12.5 pesos. And another option, which is 10 cents, which is 5 pesos a glass. Um, Basically, what competition does is it gives you these options. And you can save money on the 5 peso option, the 10-cent option. But let's suppose that, oh, it's just watered down, sour sugar water, vaguely smelling like lemon. So, you don't like it, except when you really, really want lemonade and you don't have any money. And so you spend on the 5 peso option, that's fine. But then, let's suppose that you tasted the 12.5 peso one and the 25 peso one, and then you decided they're just equally good. It's not, one isn't better than the other. If that happens, you get to understand that the cheaper option, the 12.5 peso one, is actually better because it's just as good but not as expensive. So you end up making more transactions with that Goldilocks lemonade stand more. And we repeat that over and over again, and we now know that it's gonna crowd out the consumers away from the 50 cent, the 25 peso lemonade stand and make them um, focus more on the Goldilocks lemonade stand. So it will force the more expensive option to go like, yeah, you know what? No one's buying from me anymore. I'm probably too expensive. Let me just lower prices then. So this is basically what um, competition is. Competition is essentially um, firms competing against each other um, in order to um, vie for consumers. That's the essence of it. If there's no substitute, everyone will have to pay for an option that might not be the optimal one. It might not be the best one. It might not be the cheapest one. So as a result, you as the consumer, as the buyer, will have to will suffer more because you're gonna have to spend more on something that might not be the best option. Um, and okay, so that's competition. But if they're competing, what are they competing for? What's the prize, right? What actually what's happening is that they're competing for you. They're competing for your money. And for me, that's interesting because you can get the same analysis and you can transpose it onto something else. Like, for example, politics, when candidates are vying for your vote and they spend money to get your votes, when they do all these different things, ganyan. Which is the reason why my undergraduate thesis was about political competition. Um, anyway, why do those things matter? It matters because if you're a consumer, um, more competition tends to create lower prices. Like the example I told you earlier, it creates an incentive for people to race to the bottom in terms of prices so that they can more effectively compete with their co-competitors. It also creates more choices. It also creates better quality goods. Um, but if you're a business, it's also good for you because it's easier to enter the market and start a business because there's no anti-competitive firm that is preventing you from doing so. It's also easier to access the inputs that will make your business flourish. And it's the same again if we bring it to politics. If you take a look at political dynasties, for example, um, they limit choices, and it's kind of anti-competitive because what it does is that um, dynasties use their political dominance. They abuse it in order to prevent other smaller, less powerful people from getting elected as well. So, is it the case? Wait, does it mean that fewer firms are always bad? Um, I talked to Venti about this earlier, and he said, actually, yes. Yes, sabi ni Venti, yes. Because if there are fewer firms, it's more likely that they're going to abuse their dominance. But the more technical answer, guys, promise, the more technical answer is that it's not always necessarily bad. Because the standard isn't the number of firms, but the overall effect um, it has on consumer welfare. So we look at the industry that we're analyzing here. And the best example here is the natural monopoly. And a natural monopoly happens where that industry literally cannot comprehend. It cannot accommodate more than one seller, more than one producer or supplier. The reason for that is because usually there are high capital costs um, in establishing those firms. So, for example, utilities like electric companies, ganyan, it's very expensive to enter that market because let's say you're trying to compete against Meralco or Napocor, National Power Corporation. It's very hard for you to do that because if you do that, not only will you make your own power plant, you're also going to have to make your own power lines. You're gonna have to make your own like poles or whatever. You're gonna have to manually create your infrastructure and also maintain that infrastructure. And the reason why it's not sustainable is that if there are more than one um, if there is more than one producer, um, the costs in creating and maintaining that infrastructure outweigh the possible revenues that you're going to get from doing that. Um, so for that reason, just because the structure, if you look at it, is a monopoly or an oligopoly, doesn't mean that's always bad for the consumer. And I have run a case before where I said actually tech oligopolies um, are not that bad for the poor. Actually, they're good for the poor because what happens is that you have a bunch of smaller, less dominant firms that can ride the coattails of the innovation of the dominant firms. And actually, dominance is often justified by saying we're just more efficient. And if you take a look at, for example, Cherry Mobile, if you look at my phone, I remember when I was in high school, like a decade ago, um, I remember um, one of my friends was saying, "Oh, he had a Cherry Mobile, and it's just as good as a really nice Samsung phone because it was also octa-core." So that got me thinking na, paano kaya siya naging octa-core and why is it still cheap? For me, it could only mean either one, you pay more specifically because it's Samsung, so you pay a premium for the brand, or um, the case is also what might happen also is that the bigger firms are the ones that are spending a lot of money on research and development, which is why they increase prices in order to recoup or make their money back, um, the money that they spent on research and development, and other firms can just ride the coattails by stealing the designs or something, or looking at the designs and tweaking it a little bit, but not needing to spend that much more money on it. Okay, so that means that fewer firms not always bad. Um, what about anti-competitive behavior? You have different kinds. You have agreements, anti-competitive agreements. You have an abuse of dominance. You have mergers and acquisitions. Now, I want to take a look at mergers and acquisitions first because I forgot to put more slides about them in this PowerPoint. Mergers and acquisitions. A merger is joining two entities to make one. So if you have, where's my, so if you have a red highlighter and then a yellow highlighter, if you combine them, you're gonna create a different color, the orange highlighter. That's a merger. You're joining two entities to make a new one. But acquisition is if you, as a red highlighter, you take the yellow highlighter, boom, you absorb this, but you don't change the color. It's not a completely new entity. It's the same one. But anti-competitive agreements naman, they're agreements and practices that might not be beneficial to the consumer. And abuse of dominance is basically when dominant businesses unilaterally restrict competition for everyone through abuse of that dominance. So these are different types of anti-competitive agreements. You have price fixing, which is agreeing to directly or indirectly fix purchase or selling price instead of letting supply and demand determine the prices. So that is if you have a bunch of people who are going to sell a particular good and then they agree na let's not compete on prices, let's just sell for a really high price. Let's just all agree to just do that. That's bad. That's bad. Another one is production limitation, where you have the same group of people, but they go like, wag naman yung prices. Let's just agree on how much we're going to produce. And that creates an artificial shortage, and which means that prices will also increase. There's also bid rigging. The way this works kasi is that, let's say you're a contractor. Yeah, you create buildings. Ganyan. You don't just create buildings for no reason. You create buildings for other people. So those other people, they need buildings created. But they might not know a contractor, or they might not know who the most optimal contractor is. So they open it up to a bid. They say, okay, give me your bids. Tell me how you're going to make my building. And the best bid or the cheapest bid, I'm gonna take that. So what if the people who are going to be bidding, they have an agreement amongst each other by that say, ano na lang ha, let's not compete with each other for bids. Let's not make our bids cheap. Let's make it so that you bid a really high amount and I'm gonna bid a really high amount but slightly lower than yours. And in effect, it's going to force the buyer to select a higher priced bid, even though from the point of view of the buyer, it's still lower because it's the lower bid. But in reality, both bids are higher than usual, and that's because of bid rigging. The last one is market sharing, where firms agree to divide the market. Like, sa'yo yung Luzon and Mindanao, tapos sa akin yung, Luzon and Mindanao, sa akin yung Visayas, or something like that. You take this area, I take the other area, and market sharing is not per se banned. So the next part of it is trying to differentiate what you mean by per se prohibited and what is not per se prohibited. If something is prohibited per se, that means it in itself is prohibited. Like, you can't defend it. Like, no excuses, man. No excuses. Like, you're caught doing price fixing, you have a cartel for price fixing, that's bad altogether. Like, you can't defend it. But for production limitation and market sharing, they're not per se banned, which means that you can have efficiency defenses. If you are able to prove that you're limiting your production or you're sharing the market in order to become more productive or more efficient with giving goods to the end consumer, then it's not banned, right? So why would you? How could it happen, right? How would it be more efficient for you to do that? I suppose, for example, in production limitation, you want to create an artificial shortage to increase prices, and that's fine, especially considering if um, that goods prices are very volatile and they're very essential. Like for example, oil prices, for instance. Like look at OPEC. Um, OPEC is a cartel. Cartels are illegal, but OPEC is basically a cartel, and then they tell their member countries how to make their like how much of oil they want to produce and sell. So they do create artificial shortages, and the reason for that is because they don't want sudden decreases in the prices of goods, especially because a lot of their economies are dependent on um, those goods. So their own consumers will be harmed. But for market sharing naman, I suppose it's to avoid like price wars or something like that. Anyway, they're not per se banned. So if you're very creative and you find a way to tell me that market sharing is actually going to be better for the consumers in the long run, then that's perfectly fine. Although I have to mention that even though they're not per se banned and it allows for efficiency defenses, you need to make sure that your efficiency defense is the least restrictive means to get that efficiency. So if it's true that it does make more efficient outcomes, if there is a less anti-competitive way to get those same outcomes, then the efficiency defense falls. Just take the better alternative. Abuse of dominance naman, basically saying that it's not illegal to be a dom, just don't abuse your dominance. So you have predatory pricing. So like if for example, my brother, um, if my brother and I were both selling like socks or whatever, selling socks or sacks of potatoes. And the thing is, kasi I'm the eldest child, so I was born first. So I entered the market first. And let's say that I became very dominant, and for some reason, I became very dominant in the sock market. Oh, the sock market. I like the pun. It really wasn't intended, but I was there. I like it. And then my brother tries to enter the market. He wants to sell potatoes also. What I can do, if I was being a real douche about it, is to have predatory pricing, making like creating a sale. My potatoes are 80% off. And like sure, I'm going to lose money in the short term, but what will happen is because of my sale, more and more people will buy stuff from me and my brother will end up losing money. And if my brother ends up losing money, he's gonna exit the market and I'm gonna become an only child in this market. Um, that is potentially anti-competitive, especially if it is very hard for my brother to enter the market or to re-enter it. Because if it were easy to just enter and re-enter the market, my brother would be like, okay, during your sale, I'm just gonna leave for a bit, and then after your sale, I'm gonna come back, and then I just lost a lot of money on the sales, and now I can't recoup it because yeah, you know. Another way is to have price discrimination, where you have equivalent transactions that are not treated equivalently. So, if I was a dominant sock firm, for example, and then there are two people who want to buy from me because I'm the only person who sells socks. I don't know. I'm the only person who sells socks. Um, and then I give one price to one person and another price to another person, and that other person's price is much higher. That's an abuse of dominance because that person that I charged higher for cannot does not have any other substitute. It's me arbitrarily using my dominance to force that person to spend more for the same good. The rule is that if you have equivalent transactions, they must be treated equivalently. The only exception under Section 14 ba? Section 15 of the Philippine Competition Act is when you have socialized pricing. Like you're going to give um, cheaper prices for people who are poor, or if the different prices are actually just reflections of real differences in costs depending on where you are, etc., etc. For me, they're not really exceptions. They're only exceptions because the law specifically says that it doesn't apply to those kinds of discrimination. For me, kasi, it's not you treating equivalent transactions in a way that's not equivalent, right? They're not equivalent transactions because they're poor, right? But that's more of an academic concern. Another way to do it is to have contract restriction. Restriction is very vague. It's very broad, because basically it's you using your dominance to attract people who will make contracts with you, and then you imposing some contractual obligations that might be anti-competitive. So, for example, if okay, I remember this one case in which there was this one firm that sort of tried organizing booking, like kunyari Booking.com, and it partnered with, and Booking.com was very dominant in that market. Tapos, yung ginawa niya ay, it partnered with a particular hotel. But for every partnership in those hotels, it comes with the caveat that if they get included into Booking.com, they're no longer allowed to um, make deals with the competitors of Booking.com. That is a contract, and it creates a restriction that might be anti-competitive. So there are lots of different ways that a contract can be anti-competitive. It's not the only example. There's some other stuff about um, discounts about bundling, those kinds of things. Lastly, I want to take a look at barriers to entry, and these are the same. It's the same kind of. It's the it's same in a sense that it's also vague. In a sense that you try to make it hard for others to even compete with you. The only acceptable barrier is a barrier to entry that comes out of actual efficiency. If it is a barrier to entry that is created by a dominant firm, that's an abuse of dominance. So, what's an example for this? Let's say you are a dominant airline, and you own the only airport in a particular area. And because you are so dominant and you owned the only airport in the area, you made it so that each and every other competing airline will not be allowed to um, land or fly from that airport. That is a significant barrier to entry. That's an abuse of dominance because you're depriving other people of essential facilities that will enable them to compete in the market. And that's also the reason why we also take a look at um, vertical integration and horizontal integration, those kinds of things. Anyway, barriers to entry. There are many different barriers to entry. So, what you want to take a look at is not the form of all these different types of abuses. You don't want to take a look at the form where this happens. You want to take a look at the end effect. So that's it for competition. What's a takeaway from this? I think for this entire lecture, even the previous one, you can use it to offer commentary on so many more things, even though you might not know a lot about those things. So, international relations, politics, I don't really know a lot about those things, but I can give you a really good economic extension on international relations. I can make a really good extension on politics. I can give a really good economic argument for religion, for health, all these different types of things. And the reason for that is because I have a particular mindset going in where I look at things from I look at things like an economist would. So that's the reason why the title of this presentation isn't debating economics; it's debating using economics, because you're not just looking at um, the things that they teach you in econ classes. I also wanted to take a look at how you can use the same information, the same theories for so many other different types of things. So especially for competition, I already talked about competition in politics with political dynasties. You can also use it to analyze competition between political parties. You can also use it to analyze competition between countries in terms of like vying for the affections of other people, like hard power, soft power kinds of things. Um, all different kinds of competitions. Religion is a competition. Religions compete against one another. Um, Science can be a competition because you want to produce new inventions. Art can also be considered a competition in the sense that um, a lot of dominant, oh, I really like this one, a lot of dominant firms, like producers, they tend to determine what kind of art gets made, because if you're a producer, you want to make sure that only the art that is most likely going to give me money will be produced. I'm only going to produce those kinds of pieces of art. um, and this is the reason why we get a lot of samey formulaic stuff. um, you can also take a look at Disney, for example, where because they keep acquiring so many things. They acquired Marvel, they acquired Lucasfilm, which is why all of their films have the same Disney type quality to them, right? And it ruins a lot of experiences with people, and in some cases, like those business oriented types of decisions bring you the sequel trilogy of Star Wars, where all of the decisions are just a bunch of cynical decisions that are imposed by producers. So there's no coherent story, and there's no real through line that connects all the three different movies, which is why, like, The Rise of Skywalker is basically just a sequel to The Force Awakens, but not to The Last Jedi. Those kinds of things. You can apply it to anything you want, really. If you want to learn more, you can probably learn more stuff about game theory, which is something I really, really like. Um, and yeah, I guess that's it. Econ! Econ, that's it. Thank you. I ran out of memes at the end, and I was really trying to hurry, and my throat's starting to hurt. Ugh. Mm-hmm. Wow, thanks.